Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is part 16 of What If Naruto Was in Rosario Vampire. If you guys enjoy this what if, and want to see part 17 of it, comment down below, and let me know. And go ahead and check out other what ifs in the channel. Before we start, please do support for more awesome content. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like, and also share this video with your friends. So let's start this video. Naruto took a step back as Milka exploded with power. Silver hair. Check. Red eyes. Yep. Bigger boobs and ass. Definitely. Annoyed expression. Maybe just a bit. You've brought me out already. Her eyes narrowed and flickered behind him, glinting with familiarity. What's happening? The city's being attacked. Naruto said bluntly. But listen, I need you too. He felt the same Yoki slam into his senses again, making him pause as he turned his head in the direction it came from. Naruto. I know. He turned back to Milka, seeing her looking in the same direction he had been, a frown on her face. Milka. She shook her head and focused back on him. What did you want from me? Take out as many people on the ground as you can. Naruto kept his voice as strong and confident as he could. He got the feeling that Milka wouldn't follow him, no matter what he said, if he didn't sound like he had a clue as to what he was doing. Kill them, knock them out, I don't care. Just make sure they can't do anything else to the city. Fine. She agreed after studying him for a few moments. And what will you be doing? The Yoki was still prominent, and he was sure as all hell that Milka could feel it just as much as he could. I think you already know the answer to that. Things blurred by as Sukune ran. In the sky above, he saw a helicopter let loose a missile, the projectile flying into a building and setting off a fiery explosion that rocked the ground. A few floors had been consumed in fire. He could hear their screams, despite the distance. They didn't last long, but he knew that the sound would stay with him for the rest of his life. He ignored the people running past him. They'd be fine, unless another helicopter showed up, which he wouldn't be able to do anything against anyway. The dead bodies, the torn up parts of road, and any debris that had been strewn about. Yukari was behind him. Her legs were moving faster than his, but they were shorter, and covered less distance with each step, so they were covering around the same amount of ground. Sukune ran into the closest building that was still standing. The glass sliding door had been smashed in, the top few floors had been blown out and were on fire, and the walls were burnt. He covered his mouth as he went in, coughing lightly at the thick smoke. Corpses littered the floor, bullet holes and blood was splattered on the walls, and the place absolutely stank. They've already been through here. Sukune thought. He stopped in his tracks. If the government, that's who he assumed was responsible, had already swept through the building, then he doubted anyone here was still alive, loath as he was to admit. He was about to leave and check the next building, but his eyes widened when he heard gunshots above him. Spinning around, he sprinted for the stairs and leaped up them 2-3 at a time. A man cursing and shouting reached his ears, followed by more gunshots, and he could hear Yukari running behind him. Sukune got a couple floors above ground level, and he could tell that the commotion was happening up here. He ran past the bulk of office cubicles, down the hall, around the corner, before skidding to a stop. His heart was pounding, and he felt dizzy, but he still had enough common sense to know that he shouldn't run headfirst into a confrontation without thinking things through at least a little bit first. You piece of shit. He heard the shout and a single gunshot, followed by a thud. He was close by. The next voice wasn't as loud, but Sukune could still hear it clearly. He's in there. Fire. They did. He heard the bullets fire for but a few moments, then came coughing, spitting and gurgling sounds. He moved up a bit more. He needed to see what was going on. Peeking his head around, he looked through the glass that led into a large office. There was 3 men, all clothed in black, helmets on their heads and padding on their knees and elbows, a vest over their torsos. They each held automatic machine guns, aimed at the closed, bullet-ridden wooden door on the opposite side of the office. The one in the middle moved forward and wrenched the door open. Sukune couldn't see much with the man in the way, but he could tell that the door led to a bathroom, and that there was a man with black slacks and fancy shoes on lying on the floor, blood soaking them, and pulling around him. He was still alive, apparently. You took your time in getting me. Despite his weak voice and the trouble it sounded like he was having producing noise, he gave Sukune the impression that he'd accomplished something. I had to kill 5 of you cunts before you paid me any attention. And now look at you. The man who had opened the door taunted. Dying on the floor of a bathroom, drinking your own blood, barely able to speak. Sukune dug into his pocket and brought out one of the kunai he had in there, clutching it. He still didn't have a clue as to what he was supposed to do. If he just ran in there he'd get shot to pieces, but if he didn't do anything then they were eventually going to come out and kill him, before continuing their massacre anyway. He felt Yukari slide up next to him. Glancing down at her, he saw her poke her head around him, and into the office, eyes narrowing in thought. The dying man coughed again, shifting in his position, spitting out more blood. His assailant reared his head back and wiped something off of his face. Did the guy just spit blood at his face? And I'm still a sight better than you ever will be. He raised his gun at the dying man, and Yukari waved her wand. The door to the bathroom shook and slammed shut, sending him flying across the office, his gun leaving his hands. Sukune watched with wide eyes as she kept waving her wand around, sending various things in the office into the three armed men, the metal desk, a few filing cabinets, a potted plant, the office chair, and a painting with a wooden border around it. All three of them had ended up on the floor by the time she finished, grunting and groaning, attempting to shove whatever was on top of them away. Sukune scowled. It was now or never. If he didn't go in and do something, then Yukari's actions would have been for nothing, and they'd be back at square one. He wrenched the door handle down, slamming the door open. The man closest to him reached for his gun, a pistol that had been strapped to his waist, but Sukune got to it first, aiming it down at the man who had frozen in his awkward position, just starting at him. He wore a face mask, but Sukune could still see the blue eyes, filled to the brim with trepidation and indecision. His finger resting on the trigger, Sukune's hands shook. Could he do it? It would be so easy, he just had to pull the trigger. But what about afterwards? Could he live with himself knowing that people had lost their lives because of him? He heard something crunch and a shout of pain. Looking up, he saw Yukari standing over a man with a filing cabinet laying on top of him, one held in the air. You have to do it, Sukune-san. Her voice was cold. Much colder than an 11-year-old should be. Because if you don't, then I will. Sukune looked back down at the man beneath him. He tried to tell himself that it was better this way. That the man had partly caused thousands of deaths already, would keep doing it, and that he deserved it. It didn't help him. But Sukune steadied himself and looked directly in the man's eyes before he pulled the trigger. Naruto leaped through the air, wind whipping at his face. Twisting in the air slightly, he planted his feet on the side of a half-destroyed building before launching off again, aiming himself for the side of the helicopter hovering above the street closest to him. He could see the pilot and co-pilot both looking down at the destruction. He held out his palm, and chakra began to swirl above it, spinning faster and faster, until he had fully formed a Rasengan, the sphere giving off a whirling noise. When he got close enough, he thrust his arm forward with a grunt, the rapidly spinning ball of chakra slamming into his side, right above the mounted weapons. It easily ripped through the metal. Naruto saw the co-pilot snap his head in his direction, but he couldn't really see his face. He let the rest of the technique loose, causing the airborne vehicle to tilt sideways, before beginning a rapid spin. It crashed into a building, the blade still spinning and cutting up anything in its way as it slid through a few floors. The tail had been ripped off during the crash and hung somewhat out the side of the building. Naruto didn't bother with them any more than that, leaping off again in the direction the Yuki was coming from. As he got closer, the Yuki seemed to broaden, coming from a large area, rather than a specific spot. Either whoever was causing it was grown to massive proportions without him seeing them, or they were sending their Yuki out into the area so he couldn't find them. Probably the latter. He'd be able to find them without much trouble, if he used Senjutsu, but he didn't have the time for that right now. Naruto stopped in his tracks, planting his feet on a building which had its top half in pieces over the ground. Broken steel support beams jutted out all over the exposed floor he was on, a fire raged on behind him, and there was plaster, wood, concrete, and shattered glass strewn everywhere. He didn't pay much attention to the details, instead focusing on finding the owner of the Yuki with his eyes. The sound of explosions and gunfire rocked the city around him, distracting him. He turned his head when he heard a loud push, watching as a missile descended on a group of people, and blowing them to bits. He clenched his fists. Whoever had ordered this to happen was going to suffer very harsh consequences, and he was going to deliver them himself. Something caught his attention, a subtle spike that pierced his senses. Whipping around, he only just managed to slide himself out of the way from something that probably would have cut him to shreds. He didn't have enough time to see what it was. Bending down and using his hands as he went to keep from face planting. Shards of glass, bits of plaster and concrete had been thrown up from the whoever it was his arrival, along with a thin layer of dust that was just enough to cloak their features. Naruto could make out their basic attributes, though. It was obviously a female, one with a rather petite frame and a bit short, along with tied-up, short hair. She slashed her hand through the layer of dust and it dissipated, giving Naruto a much clearer view of her. Her hair was a blackish blue, she wore a sort of black gyeongsam, coupled with a pair of black knee-high combat boots. Her skin was as pale as Milka's, but what caught Naruto's attention the most was her red eyes with a familiar vertical slit in them. She smirked. "You're quick. Who are you?" Naruto asked. The Yuki that had been permeating the air had fizzled down and was now focused directly on her. She was definitely the cause of it, no doubt about that. Better yet, are you the reason for this shitstorm? Akua. She introduced. Her voice was confident, regal and cold. I might be the reason. She took a step forward, and Naruto summoned a tri-pronged kunai into his hand. Aya, you're a twitchy one. She looked calm and relaxed, but Naruto was tense and ready for her to make a move. He could lose his head if he wasn't. The amount and strength of the Yuki she was putting out was no joke. Do you have a reason to massacre an entire city full of innocent civilians? He had to know. It might help him not only understand who he was going up against, but potentially what Fairy Tail wanted. Then again, there might not be a reason. Some people were just fed up with the world and the way it was, wanting nothing more than to just watch it burn. Now that depends. She slowly, dangerously, began to move towards him, her boots crunching on the shards of broken glass. She was going to attack any moment. Naruto sent chakra into his feet, sticking to the floor he was standing on, wanting to make sure he was staying in the one place. Are you going to stand there and die, or are you going to try and survive? As soon as her left foot hit the floor again, she rocketed forwards, shaking the building in the process. If Naruto didn't have as much experience with opponents moving at insanely fast speeds as he did, he'd probably already be dead. But, as it turned out, he managed to bring the kunai in his hands up in time to block her hand, which looked like it was going to bisect him. He thought that the steel would cut through her flesh, but instead her hand had started to cleave through it. Seeing that she was easily cutting through his weapon of choice, he pumped his chakra through it, and it held steady from then on. But that wasn't enough to stop the sheer force Akua was using. She finished the arc her arm had been going in, and Naruto suddenly felt weightless, the half-destroyed building he'd been standing on quickly disappearing. She'd used so much strength that she'd hurled him through the air, he realized, despite the chakra he'd been using to keep him grounded. He felt the back of his body smash through glass, followed by what was probably a concrete wall, then a few more, until finally he roughly bounced into another one that stopped him in his tracks. He groaned and coughed, rolling onto his hands and knees, before hurling out a bunch of blood. Ugh. He grunted and spat the rest of what was in his mouth out. Damn, that fucking hurt. It looked like it. Kurama remarked without worry. But you've had worse. I've also had better. He took in a deep breath, feeling any shards of glass that had embedded into his back pop out, as the Biju's chakra healed his external wounds. He groggily stood up, leaning his weight on a tipped-over desk, still feeling dazed. She's really strong, he murmured. Maybe more so than Mocha-chan. Stupidly fast, too. Naruto made himself focus. She was coming for him, he could sense her. He summoned a handful of tri-pronged kunais into both of his hands, throwing and scattering them around the office floor he was on. They probably wouldn't be in the building for that long, but maybe he could surprise her, catch her off guard and take her out. Mocha broke his arm, listening to the crunch and satisfaction before releasing him and spinning him around in the process, slamming her foot into his stomach and sending him into a wall. His head drooped, arms laying slack by his side. Mocha bent down and picked up his gun, snapping it in half over her knee like one would a stick. TCH. She threw the two halves away, hearing them clatter along the ground. I really didn't need to be here. They don't put up much of a fight. Despite her verbal thoughts, she continued on, killing anyone garbed in black that she came across. She had to. They were on a battlefield. If she didn't, they'd only cause more trouble for her later on. Besides, it wasn't like it really bothered her much. They were humans, her natural enemy. So, Mocha went on, snapping necks, crushing throats, throwing them from any buildings she went up into. She tried to keep any destruction to a minimum. The city had already taken a beating, and was still taking it, and any more damage might topple what little of the buildings that stood. Everywhere she went, corpses littered the ground, both civilian and military fires raged, the roads and pavement was torn up, parts of helicopters were strewn about, even a couple crashed helicopters with dead pilots inside. And she could always see at least one building that had collapsed, and left only destruction in its wake. She jogged out the back of an apartment building, past a barely hanging on door, and into an alley. Rounding the corner, she stopped in her tracks, a squad of 10 men at the end of the alley, all aiming their guns at her. 5 of them were kneeling on the ground, while the other 5 were standing behind them. Mocha didn't blink. There was enough room between each man for someone to walk through. And that's exactly what someone did. He was tall, probably 6'5" or 6'6", and wore a military uniform like the others, the only difference being instead of the black face mask, he had an angled-down black cap on, a symbol pinned to the front of it, a crow spreading its wings, 2 hills sticking out of its shoulders, showing that it was supposed to have swords strapped to its back. Seeing as he wasn't wearing a mask, Mocha could make out his facial features, sans his eyes which were covered by his cap. His skin was pale, his lips were slightly angled up, along with ebony-colored hair which fell out of his cap. What stuck out to her the most though was that she could feel Yuki coming from him. It wasn't much, but he was clearly yokai. Enjoying the night. He stopped around 5 feet in front of his men. Mocha didn't answer. No. Well, I think it's beautiful. All the blood coating the streets, piles of the dead. Who are you? She demanded. Names aren't important at the moment. He dismissed easily. But if you really want to know, then why don't you come with us, Akashi-san? Mocha narrowed her eyes. He made it sound like they were after her specifically. No, I don't think I will. Oh, come now, it's not like you've got much of a choice. He jerked his thumb over his shoulder, smile growing. See these guys? They're all packing silver bullets, you know, the ones that can kill vampires. He shrugged his shoulders in a carefree way. Maybe you can dodge some, but not all of them. They'll eventually hit you one way or another, especially in such a confined space. She didn't doubt that. She was fast, but not that fast. You won't kill me. she pointed out confidently. You wouldn't ask me to come with you if you were going to. You're right. There's someone that wants to see you, he admitted. We're not supposed to kill you, but nothing was said about how many holes would be in your body, or how many pieces you had to be in. Speaking of being in pieces, Milka smirked. Behind the man, the 5 standing men with their guns, pointed at her screamed, blood spurting out of their bodies in long slashes. The screams didn't last long, and they soon fell to the floor in separate chunks. You might want to watch yourself. There's another yokai here. He sounded surprised, but not intimidated by the display. He turned his head to look behind him. A werewolf. You bet. A blur whooshed by in the alley. The 5 remaining men opened fire, but they didn't hit their target. One of them screamed and Milka watched as he swiftly disappeared into the night, his scream getting more and more silent, until it was abruptly and roughly ended. The remaining 4 men had moved to surround their leader with their backs facing him, quickly searching around them for any signs of their would-be killer. Milka could sense him moving around, and she assumed that the military leader in front of her could as well. He hadn't even bothered to move. Suddenly, the blur came back, slamming into 2 of them in one go, claws ripping straight through the first one's stomach, while launching the second one directly at Milka herself. She reared her leg back before slamming it forward, hitting the airborne man in the side of his ribs, and sending him rocketing into the brick wall. She heard his skull the cracker smash into bits before he hit the ground, blood flowing out of his head, as his body gave off a few final twitches. When Milka looked back at the guy in command, he was alone, what would have been his last 2 men laying against either side of the alley's walls, their decapitated heads resting on the ground beside them. The man himself had blood splattered over his attire, but he still hadn't moved an inch. Are you finished? He questioned. Not a moment after the words had flowed from his mouth, Gin, his full werewolf form out, blurred into frame between him and Milka, his fur coated in blood. No? Gin's voice was low, and almost a growl. There's still one more rat left. The man tilted his head up just slightly, revealing the color of his iris in his left eye, red, just like hers. He lifted his arm, as if to beckon Gin to come to him. Then by all means, finish the job. Naruto watched as she smashed through the window, pretty much bouncing off the floor, and letting her momentum carry her body towards him. He wasn't going to stand there, and take it this time. She'd just lift him off his feet, and send him for another trip through the city. He flipped through a couple of hand signs, preparing. When he was done, he sucked in as much air as he could take, and when she was just about to bisect him with her hand a hair's length away he moved, appearing right above her crouched on the ceiling. Futen, Shinku Chijoku. From his mouth, a large sphere of wind shot out, rapidly expanding as it went. It sliced through Akua and slammed into the floor, ripping everything in its way to shreds, sending bits and pieces of what was left all over the place, obscuring Naruto's vision and getting him to move to another one of the kunai. He could hear it, going all the way through every floor in the building. But she was still alive. He could still sense and see her. Despite having seen it hit her right in the top of her skull himself, she was far from dead. She was standing in the same spot that she had been when his technique had hit her. The swiftly rotating wind that had surrounded her and flung things throughout the floor they were on slowly started to dissipate until it was completely gone. Akua smiled playfully, reaching up to the nape of her neck. When she brought her hand back there was blood on it, not a whole lot, just a fine line along her index finger. Bringing her hand up, she traced her tongue along the length of her finger, lapping it up. You nicked me. Naruto picked up the kunai that was stuck in the floor at his feet, smiling easily. You really shouldn't stop moving. He waited a moment, then the next frame he saw was of Akua's back facing him. Swinging his arm, he made a move to decapitate her, and end it now. But she apparently had an astounding reaction time, spinning around and slicing the blade of the kunai clean off in one fluid motion. Naruto ducked down and moved in low, extending his arm in an attempt to tag her. He could see her leg moving towards him, but he kept going. He had to get it on her. His hand was only inches away, her leg even closer to his chest. Everything moved at a snail's pace. He could see it. What was going to happen? He passed the point of no return. Even if he tried to back out now and dodge her leg, he wouldn't succeed. All he could do was hope that he'd be able to tag her while he was still in reach. The knee slammed into his chest before he punctured the ceiling, his body breaking through the next few floors, until he slowed down enough to not break through the next floor, gravity making him fall down and break a wooden desk in the process. He pulled himself to his knees slowly, coughing out blood and any other fluid that wanted to make an exit through his mouth. Wiping his face with his sleeve, he smirked. He could pretty much feel his ribs snap back together as his pain started to dull and fade away, the sensation of natural chakra rushing into his system at a rapid pace. The clone that he had made before Akua arrived had obviously dispersed. It was a bit later than he would have preferred, but oh well. It didn't matter now, he supposed. Naruto could feel one extra of his seals moving around below him. So he had managed to get it onto her, somewhere either that or she was screwing around with one of his kunai just to mess with him, but he doubted it. Fixating his attention on it, he instantly vanished from his position, appearing right beside the unsuspecting Akua. He didn't waste any time, and snatched her arm in both of his hands, knowing that if he let up for even a fraction of a second then she'd have a chance to fight him back. Using the extra strength he'd gained from the natural chakra, he flung her around before letting go, rocketing her through a few walls and eventually out of the building. Naruto appeared by her again, catching her in midair, and flipping her over, so that her back was facing the ground with him above her. He sent a hard punch at her gut, and she brought up her arms to block it, which she successfully did, but she didn't stop the immense force behind it, and was sent on a very rapid descent into the ground. It sounded like an explosion had gone off when she hit the road split and was ripped apart, creating cracks and gaps all around so large that they began to scale what was left of the surrounding buildings. Chunks of debris were hurled into the air, obscuring his vision. He didn't give her a chance to recover, using the seal he placed on her to once more appear at the position she was at, swinging his fist straight away. He felt it slam, and destroy something hard beneath him. Adjusting to his current surroundings, he noticed that he was where Akua had crash-landed, but she wasn't there. Instead, her clothes lay in the destroyed road, his fists buried into them in the earth. Naruto frowned. Did she figure it out already? Standing up, he looked towards where he could sense her Yuki, and hear her combat boots hit the destroyed road. Apparently, she wore a white sundress that went down to just above her knees underneath. She looked a bit disheveled and beaten, but no fatal injuries or broken limbs, and she had a competitive glint in her red, slitted eyes. Come on, Naruto-kun. She grinned in excitement. You need to do better. That's not nearly enough to kill me. Naruto readied himself and got into a fighting stance. He debated on whether or not to bother with putting another seal on her, but decided against it. She'd probably just keep stripping down and render them pointless. Unless he had a chance to get one directly on her skin, he wasn't going to bother. Mocha saw a rosary on a small chain slip out of his sleeve, the chain sitting nicely around his wrist. She narrowed her eyes. He was a vampire as well, and the small show of the object explained why he seemed confident despite his low amount of Yuki. In blasted forward, his already blinding movement speed enhanced by the moonlight. She heard a clink as the other vampire detached his rosary, exploding with power, as soon as he'd done so. The werewolf didn't have enough time to back out now, whether he wanted to or not, he was too invested in the attack. She saw her senior's blur slam into him, but he brought his arm up just before collision, and hit Gin right under his chin with the back of his hand. The werewolf was sent soaring through the air, his body smashing through a window and into an apartment. She heard several other crashes soon follow. I'm assuming you're done with the whole talking thing. Mocha looked back down to the other vampire, his red slitted eyes and ebony hair out for the world to see, along with a sneaky smile. I'll take that as a yes. He didn't seem as strong as she was, not in Yuki nor physical strength. But that didn't mean she could completely disregard him. He was a vampire like her. Maybe he had superior speed. He had been able to move quick enough to launch Gin into the building. Mocha kicked off from her spot, rocketing forward, extending her leg out when she was close to him, and slamming it right under his ribcage. His body hunched over her leg for a moment, before propelling out of the alley, across the road, tearing up the ground as he went, into the alley on the opposite side, until finally his body slammed through the 4 stories that had been left of a once much taller building, making it collapse in on itself. She watched as it fell with mild interest, but didn't let it captivate her attention entirely. He was still very much alive, she could sense him, and things were just never that easy. There was an explosion of air that rocketed out from the building, collapsing in on itself, sending any dust, dirt, and debris soaring away from it. Mocha was about to go in pursue, but stopped herself, and not a moment later Gin blurred into her peripheral vision, standing beside her. He looked roughed up, but fine otherwise. Mocha-san, we'll take him together. Oh, great. Now she had to deal with idiocy, too. No. She said bluntly, not even bothering to spare him a glance when his shoulders slumped, and a suddenly depressing aura overcame him. You need to finish where I left off, deal with all the ground soldiers. What? So I deal with the grunts, while you and Naruto take on the bigger threats? Yes. She began to walk towards where she'd booted the vampire. That shouldn't be too hard for you, should it? He grunted in disapproval. Turning her head over her shoulder, she glared at him. He froze. Nope. Not at all. In's voice sounded a tad more high-pitched than usual. She faced her head forward, continuing on her path. Good boy. Mocha made her way through the trench she made with the vampire's body, across the road, and through the alley until she reached the collapsed building. He was still in there, unmoving. Maybe he was unconscious. Yuki's signatures and flow didn't change much, sometimes not at all, just because they weren't awake. She took another step forward and her eyes widened. Angling her body, she just managed to avoid a large chunk of building, hearing it slam behind her and break into a bunch of smaller chunks. Frowning, she waited, and just a moment later another one larger than the last came towards her from the hell of building. Instead of dodging this time, she brought her leg up and swung it down on the large piece, smashing it into tiny rocks that bounced on the ground around her before settling. She wasn't going to wait for the next one. Lunging forward, she slammed her first into the hell of rubble. The chunk she'd hit directly shattered instantly, along with the window that had been attached to it. Her arm kept going, the force of her hit reverberating through the entire hellpile mountain of brick, glass, wood, plaster, steel, and whatever else had been keeping the building standing. On the outside, it was only vibrating just a bit. But on the inside, she could feel it all slamming, smashing, crunching against itself. Before long, she sensed him moving up, and then she watched as his torso burst out the top, dragging the rest of him soon after. His clothes were torn in some places, showing off some of his pale-skinned body. But even then, he still maintained a regal and proud look to him. Like any other vampire would, she supposed. Especially from just a small skirmish like that. That was unsavory. He dusted off and patted down his uniform. Ooh, and that kick, it actually hurt. Are you going to keep running your mouth? Afraid not, Akashi-san. He reached behind him and pulled out a pistol, but he was too far away for her to see any detail on it. We were given a set amount of time to clear out the city, you see, before the next lot of them is coming in to collect. What he said had gained her interest. Who was he speaking about? What were they coming to collect? Why was it necessary to clear the city beforehand? She forced all of her questions into the back of her mind. It wasn't time for her to wonder. She needed to fight and beat the vampire in front of her. In the distance, above the military man's head, she watched as a helicopter fretted about, a blue dash soaring around at Kurumu. She went around and around it until she came up from behind, forcing the co-pilot's door open. That's when Mocha focused back on the vampire, and smirked as she readied herself for an actual fight. Kurumu forced the co-pilot's door open, blasting the both of them with her allure as soon as she could. They both relaxed in their seats, tension leaving their shoulders, the co-pilot's hand leaving the holstered pistol he was about to grab alone. She quickly snuggled herself in, slamming the door shut as she made use of the co-pilot's lap to seat herself. It was squishy, barely any room at all, but she made it work. Now? She smirked deviously, arching her back into the co-pilot, as to draw more attention to herself. It only made her allure that much more effective. How about the two of you help me out a bit? I've got a bit of a problem. Of course, anything. They sounded enthusiastic. But of course they did. The others before them had sounded the same, even after she told them to crash their helicopters and kill themselves, all because they thought they had a chance to fulfill their desires with her. See all the helicopters polluting the sky. She looked out of the cockpit as she spoke, eyes flickering between all the aircraft. They were scouring the area, searching for any and all survivors, and when they found some, they'd swiftly deal with them. They're no longer your allies. They are enemies as well as my own. She glanced back at the co-pilot, shifting slightly, before looking towards the pilot. Will you help me get rid of them? There was no hesitation in the pilot's voice. Definitely. He moved the stick around, turning the helicopter slightly, and making it fly forward. A few fast-paced beeps rang out in the cockpit, and the pilot clicked a button on the side of the stick. Not a moment after, she heard the missiles fire up, before seeing them fly off and slam into the side of an identical helicopter, sending it up in a fiery blaze, what was left of the vehicle falling from the sky and crashing into the ground below. Kurumu grinned at the success of her plan. This would be so much easier and quicker than going from helicopter to helicopter, forcing each and every man to commit suicide against their will. She'd have to keep refreshing her allure every now and then. Of course it didn't last forever. But that was perfectly fine with her. She felt the co-pilot's hands creeping up on her hips. She frowned. He was getting too touchy for her liking, so she slapped his hands away. No touching. She glanced over her shoulder and winked at him. Not just yet. Business comes first. He seemed disgruntled by that but didn't put up any more resistance. Kurumu sighed and settled down a bit more, trying not to bump any controls around her, lest she hit the wrong thing and crash the helicopter they were in. Naruto spun around, swinging his arm behind him as she mirrored his action, their hands colliding in the middle of them both. A shockwave rocked out from the force, blowing any rubble away, the ground beneath them cracking under the pressure. He twisted his hand round, attempting to grab her wrist. Instead of coming into contact with flesh like he'd intended, his hand slipped through her, and he nearly got his head lopped off forward, managing to slip out of the way thanks to the natural chakra coursing through him. They'd gotten into a large, spacious area, the heart of a city. Smack bang in the middle, right where they were both standing, was pavement in a pentagon shape for civilians to walk, and it was basically untouched as far as destruction went. Branching out from the pentagon, on all 5 sides, were pedestrian crossings that went across the roads flowing around the pentagon. There was traffic lights everywhere, most of them either broken, bent over, or completely destroyed. On the other side of the road from the pavement were buildings, all placed around to mirror the pentagon's positioning. None of them were complete burning stumps compared to what they had been just hours ago. Naruto straightened himself up and scowled at Akua. He was running out of natural chakra to utilize. He tried to create clones in order to run off and gather some more, but she killed them before they'd gotten the chance. He'd even let her throw him across the city in order to create a large distance between them very rapidly, but she'd apparently sensed it and destroyed it with relative ease. Even when he'd made a mass of them, she'd hunted every single last one down. He was losing, he knew it, and she sure as hell knew it. The smug satisfaction on her face told him that. So, he considered his options. Sasuke's Sharingan. Out of the question. It had almost killed him the last time he tried to use it in conjunction with his senjutsu, which he still didn't know as to why that was. Plus it was still kind of out of order from when he'd used Susanoo against Kaio. He wasn't an Uchiha, and using something of such a high caliber like that had its consequences. He was just glad he didn't go blind from it. He could use Hiraishin Shuriken, he supposed, but he doubted it would do much, and would just end up wasting his chakra. It wasn't fast enough to hit her, and it was too destructive in this kind of area. He could still sense people around, not many, but still there, hiding away. He assumed that they'd been able to hide themselves from the military that had swept through. That left Kurama's aid as a trump card. But he didn't want to have to resort to using his chakra. He only wanted to rely on his partner when necessary, like when he had to get away with Milka from the police, or whatever they were called. They weren't in police uniform. He wanted to do things with his own set of skills and abilities. It's what he'd been bloody trained for. What about Kaio? Did you need to intimidate him? Naruto twitched. Yes. He could almost feel the amused smirk Kurama undoubtedly had. The Biju damn well knew why. He just liked being a pain in the ass. He's not going to do anything against for me a long time because of it. He was jerked back into reality, deflecting Akua's arm above him, quickly forming a Rasengan, and slamming it into her chest. But, like plenty of times before, it just went straight through her like she wasn't even there to begin with. Oh yeah. On top of her almost matching him in physical strength, and having much superior speed, she could slip through anything he threw at her, whenever she felt like it. It was like going against Obito all over again, only he didn't know if there was a limited time she could use it for. There was one thing he could take advantage of, at least her reaction time wasn't as fast after using it. He'd been able to get a few hits in from that. Granted, the difference was less than a second, but it was still enough for him to exploit and put her in a situation she couldn't do anything about. He went with it and let his body slip through her, letting the spiraling sphere of chakra dissipate into nothing. Once he'd gone though he flipped his body around and slammed his heel into the back of her head, sending her face first into the ground, sending out spiderweb cracks from the force behind it. Naruto didn't let up. He brought up his foot and went to embed her head into the ground even more. Hopefully even crack her skull badly enough for her to be completely out of it. Akua apparently had other plans, though. She lifted herself up off the ground with her hands somewhat in span, hooking her leg behind his knee and ripping him off his balance. He managed to plant his foot back on solid ground and keep himself stable, but she wasn't having any of it. With a grunt of effort, she jerked and put more strength into her leg, sending him sliding along the ground and allowing her to pick herself up. You're still holding back. She sounded annoyed, but still looked competitive along with the desire to see his head leave his shoulders. Come on, show me everything you've got. This is it. He gestured to himself with a shrug. This is what I've got in all its glory. Sorry to disappoint. You're lying. She called him out without so much as blinking. You used it before, to get away from being shot and killed on the spot. Naruto frowned. How long have you been in this city? A while. She took a step in his direction, a determined glint in her already competitive red eyes. You've got a price on your head, but that's not important. She moved forward again. Now show me, Naruto-kun. Show me all of what you're capable of. He was strong, she loathed to admit. Not so much in the offensive department, but in defensive, he could take all her hits head on, and still get up from it. She sent him through buildings, used enough force to break steel on his bones, but he was still there, firing off that damn pistol that could kill her in one shot if it hit the right spot. Asshole. She sneered at him as he dusted off his tattered uniform. No need for such rude language, Akashi-san. He scolded and aimed his gun at her for the millionth time, the silver gleaming in the moonlight. Are you getting frustrated? You could just come along without any conflict. I told you before. She blasted forward, slammed the underside of her foot into his chin, sending him rocketing into the air. He slammed into the side of a building a few stories high and punctured through the broken roof, but he still went higher. Milka heard it, a gunshot. Then some smashed into the ground beside her, loud and sudden enough to make her flinch. Looking to where the sound had came from, she saw a silver bullet. He'd shot at her, for the first time since they'd started fighting. The bullet itself looked too big to fit inside the barrel of his gun, but she didn't question it, and it had markings running along it. She looked back up to see him standing on the roof he'd rocketed out of just moments before, pistol aimed directly at her. She moved as quickly as she could, not stupid enough to let herself get hit by one of those things. He fired and followed her as she leaped over, and slid under large pieces of rubble, upturned road, bits of buildings, and cars. Milka cursed herself. She'd unintentionally given him the higher ground, and he had a weapon that didn't need to be used at close range. At least she had mobility on her side. He probably wasn't going to hit her, so long as she kept moving. Then again, he could get used to his own movements as well as hers fairly quickly, and land a shot on her. She had to either get close to him herself, or make him come close to her. She preferred the latter. It would be easier to execute and was more practical. He'd shot a few more rounds at her by the time she'd hurled herself through a glassless window, each shot getting remotely closer and closer. Mocha took in a quick breath and studied her surroundings. The place was ruined, barely recognizable, but there was enough evidence to make her think she was on the bottom floor of a hotel. Half-broken and burned framed paintings were strewn about, potted plants, and their soil-worn chunks. The once good-looking mahogany walls were burned to crisp. The large rug that stretched for miles was torn up into little bits. The reception desk was in 4 separate parts. And the computers and phones were now nothing but unusable hardware and circuit boards. There was no dead around, though, but she brushed it off and figured they'd either gotten out or to higher floors before being killed. Perfect. She'd seen it glinting dangerously next to the case of the computer. It was a square pole, the ends of it were rough and jagged, but looked sharp enough to pierce flesh without a problem. It was probably about 20 or so inches in length. Yes, it would do just nicely, now she just had to wait. Mocha didn't like waiting, not taking action. But she would, patiently. He was after her, not the other way around. He didn't have much of a choice, but to follow her and get much closer. Sukune didn't know how many people he'd escorted out and away from the city, but it was probably close to 1,000. He'd gotten them into groups of 20 or 30 each time he went outside of the danger zone, and he'd been in and out of it so much that he'd lost count. 1,000 people was insignificant, and he knew it damn well. Fujimi City wasn't exactly large, but it was far from small. There would have been roughly a couple 100,000 people or more in there when it had been attacked. A mere 1,000 people from that. It was nothing in comparison. They made it to the crest of the hill, not far from where Naruto and Mocha had fought Yukata. If it wasn't so dark, they would have been able to see the destruction that was there. Okay. Sukune shouted out over the noises of the people he was leading away from the burning city. This is as far as we can take you. Just keep going through the field, you'll eventually come to a road. Follow that out of the city for a few kilometers, and you'll reach a town. Be quick about it. Yukari chimed in. And if any of you can afford transport, keep getting further away. The group of 20 or so people didn't move or talk. They looked confused and scared, some still sobbing quietly either from shock or the deaths of people they knew. Sukune was sympathetic and had seen it coming. All the other groups had pretty much the same reaction. So he just waited. One of them would begin moving soon enough, and the others would follow. He was right. Only a few moments later, a man in his early 20s compassed himself and started his trek, shoving his blood-soaked hands into his pockets with his head hung low. The others followed behind him, a similar mood and look on their faces. At the back of the pack was a girl, younger than Yukari, probably 9 or 10, followed in a daze. Her loose shirt was covered in blood, as well as her hair and bare legs, and her eyes so dulled, like she couldn't care less as to what happened in the world anymore. Sukune managed to turn his attention away from her. He'd seen that same look on younger kids so many times tonight that it really didn't bother him as much as it should. Hell, he'd seen a lot worse in terms of kids. He'd seen their bodies, their blood leaking out of wounds and painting the streets. He'd seen a number of them executed, hearing their parents, friends and family members scream out in agony before they too were silenced. Hey. He felt Yukari nudge him with her elbow. The apathetic expression she had during the entire ordeal was gone, replaced with exhaustion, both mental and physical. Why are they doing this? I don't like you humans, but this is just a massacre. Her lower lip trembled and she bit down on it. What are they getting out of it? What purpose demands so many deaths? Sukune was silent for a moment as he stared at the burning city. They weren't going back in there. There was nothing left. They'd scoured every building, office, apartment complex and store that was even remotely standing to get people to safety. They had some more run-ins with the military, but with Yukari's help and the gun he now had, they were dealt with, only a few civilians dying from stray gunfire on his watch. I don't know, he admitted. But nothing justifies it. And I will never forgive whoever's responsible. Yukari frowned and sat down on the grass, bringing her legs up to her chest. Now we just have to wait for Naruto-san and Mocha-san, don't we? He'd ran out. The last little bits of natural chakra had left him, and he had no way of getting it back. This girl, this vampire, Akua, had pushed him to his limit, and as someone who enjoyed fighting and a challenge, he respected her for that. She wanted him to go harder on her too, to use his partner's chakra, and show her in full force what they could do. Naruto didn't want to. He was stubborn, he knew, and he wanted to be able to kick her ass without help. Plus, it sounded like bait to him, like she wanted him to show her all he could do not only for a challenge, but for more information on him. That's the way it had worked in the shinobi world anyway. But, he mused, stopping his run from the vampire so he could get his bearings and make a decision. He had to use the Hiraishin to aid him in that. Of course, she was much faster than him without it. I don't really have a choice. I'm going to lose if I don't, and I'll die when I lose. Finally tired of running, Naruto turned around to face her. Blood ran down the side of her face, but she didn't look bothered by it in the least. Her white sundress was ripped and torn a whole lot from their fight, yet he didn't let his mind wander in perversion. Now wasn't exactly the time. Jiraiya would be rolling in his grave. Kurama added his 2 cents. Oh, don't you start. He probably rolls in his grave every time I see a girl and don't have thoughts of banging them. He retorted. She is pretty good looking though. In a short and small kind of way. Definitely his student. Yeah. Naruto answered Akua's question, letting his breathing slow and his body relax. No more running. Good. She still had excitement shining in her eyes, along with a tinge of hope. But now you're going to die. Unless you show me what you're hiding. Then you better hope you can handle it. He felt Kurama's chakra flood his system, coating him in a golden cloak. The small, near-constant amount of smoke that was hanging around the city like a plague was blasted away from the area, and what little windows remained intact rattled in protest. Naruto glared at her. Because I'm going to kill you. Akua's mouth twitched upwards, and he slammed into her, ripping her down the long road, tearing through the ground, and anything that got in his way. There was a few stories of toppled-over building laying horizontally on the street, half caved in. He went straight through it and came out the other side a second later, using her body to take the brunt of the force. He heard her hurl and gag, then she slipped through his grasp, and he came to a screeching halt, digging into the road, spinning around to face her. Her hand covered her mouth, and she retched and jerked a bit before removing it, blood staining her palm. She wiped it on the hem of her sundress, spitting out what was left in her mouth, and looked back up at him. He thought that she would look at least a little bit worried, but she didn't. She actually looked joyful. Oh, I can handle it. She grinned in that same way again, and Naruto began to wonder whether she was sane. Let's test that. He covered the distance between them in just a moment, carrying her and flinging her through a building, and out the other side, leaping through the large holes he'd made with her body, so she didn't leave his sight. A claw made of chakra shot out of his back, grabbing her in midair, the sudden stop being strong too enough to break bones, but she didn't even flinch. Instead, she twisted around and swung her hand down in an arc when he was close enough, moving to slice him up. It didn't work out in her favor. He swiftly snatched her wrist and bent it at an unordinary angle, roughly snapping the bones, and making her give a short scream of pain. Naruto moved his hands up her arm, getting a steady grip as they hurled through the air. Using the chakra claws still surrounding her as support, he pulled, hard. Her shoulder dislocated instantly and without any problems, and her eyes whitened when he didn't let up for a moment. He was going to tear her entire arm off. He would have too, if she hadn't pulled another Obito and slipped away from him. That shit was annoying. Akua landed on the ground hard and stumbled slightly, her right arm limply hanging by her side. Naruto landed on the side of a building, a few stories high. She saw him, and then did something that surprised him. She bolted. She didn't seem like the type to run from a fight, no matter how outmatched she seemed to be. But that's exactly what she was doing. Naruto huffed through his nose and went after her. With Kurama's chakra, he was a whole lot faster than she was, and managed to catch up to her rather quickly, just as she dashed around a corner. He followed without a second thought, but immediately stopped in his tracks, both at what he was seeing in front of him, and the abrupt entrance of a very familiar chakra. No? But seeing you again, Naruto. Naruto couldn't believe it. He was alive. He should be dead. He told himself, but there he was, standing right in front of him, an amused smirk on his semi-disfigured face. Can't say the same, Obito. Shame. He put his gloved hand on Akua's shoulder, and she jerked her head in his direction, giving him a look that all but promised excruciating pain. Our job here is done, Shuzen. Obito looked back directly into Naruto's eyes, his one Rinnegan eye and Sharingan eye burning a hole into his head. Until next time. And just like that, they disappeared in a swirl that only made Naruto realize it was genuinely Obito all the more. He didn't even move to stop them, he couldn't, he was stuck in place. He noticed Kurama's chakra recede but still didn't budge, simply staring at the spot where the man that had caused all of his problems was just moments before. Naruto. He lashed out, slamming his fist into the brick wall beside him so hard that it cracked. Pain shot through his arm, but he ignored it. How the fuck is he alive? He gritted out, tightening his fists into balls of flesh. I hadn't sensed him this whole time. He's supposed to be dead. Why isn't he dead? You need to calm down and think. No, I will not calm down. He snapped and leaned his weight on the wall and glared at the ground. He's alive. He's going to do it again. He's going to kill everyone. He reared his arm back, and smashed his fist into the wall again, breaking it even more and starting to cave it in, breathing out harshly. Why is he still fucking breathing? Kurama was silent for only a few moments. Don't fool yourself, Naruto. He said without any sympathy in his voice. You already suspected he was alive, and there was every bit of a chance that he'd lived like you had. You shouldn't be surprised. Yeah, but... Naruto huffed out angrily. His partner was right, he tried to reason with himself. It had always been possible, and started to have his suspicions, when he'd been woken up that night and felt it, only growing more when Ishigami had miraculously disappeared from the student police's HQ. It had only been there for a minuscule amount of time, but he knew who it was, he'd just chosen to deny it. He's alive. The Bidyu chimed in bluntly. So how are you going to deal with him? I don't know. Moka had felt it, Naruto's massive and oppressive energy flooding the entire city. It was different somehow, but still recognizably his. It helped that she'd felt him use it before in the student police's HQ. It was gone now, but it still made her wonder, what was he actually capable of doing? With the power she felt rolling off of him, even from this distance, he'd probably be able to cause wanton destruction that few, if any at all, could ever hope to match. It made her wonder what kind of opponent he was up against, for him to need to resort to using that much power. She would have kept thinking about it, but her very own opponent was closing in, coming up the flight of stairs to reach the third-floor hallway. One at a time, he came up, slowly. He was taking his time. Why? She didn't know, nor really care, but it was annoying. Eventually, his hair popped into her view, followed by his face and the rest of his body. His pistol was hung lazily in his right hand, shining silver, ready to shoot her at a moment's notice. Well, he could try, but he wasn't going to land a hit on her with that thing. He stopped at the top, and they both just stared at each other, waiting for the other to make the first move. Milka gripped the square pole she had tightly. It turned out to be him. Milka moved her head out of the way as he raised his arm and fired, the bullet whizzing by her head. She immediately burst forward, keeping her eyes on his gun as he fired, using it to predict where the bullets were going to go, so she could move and respond appropriately. He pulled the trigger again, and she sidestepped in the middle of her sprint to avoid it. That was the sixth one, the last he could shoot before needing to reload. But she was close enough now, he didn't have time to do that, and apparently he knew that as well as he dropped his gun to the floor. She flashed her leg out, and slammed it into his side, sending him through the wall, and into a room. Just hitting him wasn't enough, she knew that. He'd been able to take what she'd given him so far, and still get back up. That's what the square pole she grabbed was for. Milka hauled herself over the hole she'd made with his body, and into the hotel room. Aw. He had his hand over his ribs, like they'd been damaged. You don't skip leg day, do you? What's your name? He coughed, straightening himself out with effort, breathing harder. Why do you care? I don't. Milka admitted bluntly. But you were actually able to put up a fight. The least I can do is get your name. Sorry. He narrowed his eyes into a glare. That's all you're getting. And it won't be the last time you hear it. She was suddenly in his space. He threw a punch at her, but she grabbed his wrist and jerked his arm, dislocating his shoulder. He grunted and brought up his knee towards her stomach. In retaliation, she spun the square pole in her hands around and brought it down, sticking it into his thigh and forcing it through to the other side. His mouth opened to yell out in pain, but only received an elbow to the face that quickly shut him up. Milka yanked the pole out of his leg. He wobbled around a bit, dazed, before tripping over his own feet and landing on his back. He rolled onto his side, opened his mouth, and red liquid spewed forth onto the floor. Damn it. He gurgled and spat, doing his best to crawl away from her, but he wasn't getting far. You bitch. She put her foot on his chest and rolled him back over so he was facing the ceiling. She brought the square, sharp and jagged pole into the air, and watched as his eyes widened when she brought it down straight through his neck, using enough force to embed a good few inches of it into the floor. His mouth opened and blood gushed out. His body twitched all over like he was having a seizure, and she watched. After a few moments, he gave off one last sound of struggle, before he gave off his last breath, and his body stopped moving. No? Milka said as she moved over to the window to look out over the burning city. There was only 2 helicopters in the sky that she could see left, and one soon disappeared in a fiery explosion as the other had launched missiles at it. She could only assume it was Kurumu's doing. I don't think I will be hearing that name again. Kurumu sighed in relief. That had been the last one. She watched the wreckage fall from the sky, colliding with a building that made it spin before crashing into the ground. She leaned back into the co-pilot and smiled. Great job, you two. So, is that what you needed us for? Yes and no. She sat up straight, and wiggled closer to the door. There's still one more thing I need the two of you to do. Which is? The co-pilot asked. His hand rode up her leg and she batted it away. This one's simple, much more so than what the two of you just did. She smiled and grabbed the door. I need you to kill yourselves. Crash this helicopter, and die inside of it. Then, you can have me in any way you want. Something like this wouldn't work on Iashi. But humans. They were so much easier to manipulate. Convincing them to end their own lives for her didn't take too much effort at all. Of course. They both said enthusiastically. Great. She grinned and forced the door open, her wings bursting out of her back as she jumped out. Have fun. The helicopter was still for a moment or two, before it zoomed forward with a scream, smashing straight through a building. The blades chopped through everything in the way like butter, and before long there was a loud boom as it lit up in a fiery blaze, smashing any glass that was still intact in the immediate area, and killing the two that had been inside. Kurumu sighed to herself as she began to fly towards the Witch's Hill. It's over. Thanks for listening. I do hope you enjoyed. If you want a next part of this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification, and also check out the other videos that I have created, and enjoy. See you in the next video. Peace.